Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are back for session 3 of our 5-day sessions on polish before publishing, which is really just about getting your content like up to sparkly status so that it's good for people to look at. Today's session and tomorrow's sessions will focus on photography. So today we're going to do photography 101. Tomorrow we're going to be focusing on photo editing. So feel free to come back for that one if you're interested in learning how to edit on both. We're going to focus on an iOS device, so mobile devices. A lot of what we'll cover, I think, should be applicable to other platforms as well. And then we'll dip into Photoshop for just a little bit to show you some of the super basics. We're only going to be scratching the surface on that one because if you've used Photoshop before, you know it's a really tedious program to learn, especially in like a 60-minute session. Today's session, we are also going to kind of scratch the surface on photography. I'm going to kind of go over some basics that you should think about as you're taking photos. And I've structured this in a couple different sections. So the first section is really talking about the exposure triangle, making sure that you understand different camera settings. And I know several people emailed me and said or asked if this session would be good for mobile photography, or do I have to have an SLR or mirrorless or other kind of dedicated camera? In reality, I'm hoping this session will be applicable to all types of photography. So even if you're using just a mobile device, there are still some apps that you can use that will help you get in and like change different settings like your ISO and your shutter speed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go in. And then we'll kind of dive a little bit into just tips and tricks for like general compositional rules, things to think about with different forms of photography, like if you're doing food photography or people photography. I'm also going to speak a little bit about macro photography, which is my personal area of specialization within the photography scope. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll jump right in here. As always, feel free to send your questions in as we go. I'm going to keep the chat box open so I can see those questions come in, and I'll try to respond to them as we go through our first few sections here. So let's just dive right into our introduction, talking a little bit about the exposure triangle. So when we talk about photography, in reality, photography is basically just the recording of light on some sort of light sensitive medium. So in the film days, that light sensitive medium would have been film. These days, in the digital world, we're talking about a sensor. And whether you're using a cell phone or using a big camera like an SLR, there is a sensor that lives in the back of your camera. And that records light. And there are different ways that we can let light come into the camera. There's also different things that we can do with the sensor to make it more or less sensitive to light. And these all basically are combined to give you your exposure. So the three corners, I should say, of the exposure triangle are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So the shutter speed is just the length of time that the shutter stays open. And if you are allowing your shutter to stay open for a long period of time, you're letting more light into the camera. If that shutter is going to be really fast, then you're letting less light into the camera. Now, longer shutter speeds tend to be really good for low light situations, so where you need to let in as much light as possible. But when your shutter stays open, you're also going to get some movement in your photograph. So if there's anything in your photo that is moving, even if you're like photographing a garden and there's a little slight wind that's blowing, a longer shutter speed, you will see that slight movement of the flowers blowing in the wind. Longer shutters are also really difficult for photographing children, speaking from personal experience, particularly children in low light situations. If you've ever tried to photograph kids that are moving or pets that are moving or insects or anything else with a cell phone, in a low light situation like indoors or in the evening hours when there's not a lot of a ton of sunlight outside, because it's a lower light situation, your camera is going to use a longer shutter, and that's why you're probably getting a lot of movement expressed in those photographs. Now, fast shutters are really good for freezing motion. So if you're ever doing photographing, like a sporting event, or photographing something like an insect and you want to get those wings frozen in flight, that is when fast shutters are really good. But you have to have a lot of light to have a fast shutter speed. So this would be a good example of where we tend to see really long exposures or longer shutter speeds used. So this is a waterfall. Most of these photos also are not mine. I should mention these are stock photos that I got from my favorite stock photo site, RawPixel, which I can talk more about later if you are interested in learning more about some stock image websites. This is a waterfall. Notice how there is movement expressed in the waterfall. So do you think this was a long shutter or a short shutter? And you can just type into the chat what you think this was. Yeah, so everybody's saying long. So this was a long shutter speed. And by keeping your shutter open a little bit longer, you actually get movement from the waterfall. Now, when we see photos like this, you're probably assuming that these were taken on a big camera like an SLR or a mirrorless, and there's a good chance that it was. There is actually a way to do this. I know for a fact on iOS devices you can kind of express movement if you're using live photo. And at the end here, I can try to connect my phone in and actually show you how to do that. But if you're interested in getting like a longer exposure, you turn on your live photo feature, and once you take the photo, you just swipe up on that photo and select, I think it's long exposure is what it says. And it'll basically take that, because a live photo basically takes a few seconds before the photo and a few seconds after. So if you hold it down, there is that, it's like the Harry Potter style of photography, right? Where there's some movement that happens. For those of you who don't have iOS devices, I apologize. You probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But for those of you with an iPhone or iPad, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. But there is a way to create that long exposure on a cell phone, which is actually a really cool thing to do. So long exposures express movement, which is really great. Now, in order to get a photo like this too, especially if you're in like a daylight situation where you have a ton of light already, keeping that shutter open for a long period of time, you're probably going to be so overexposed in your photo that you have to use something like a neutral density filter, which would attach to your camera's lens, and it basically darkens the entire exposure. So it's forcing less light to come in, but because your shutter is staying open for so much longer, you can properly expose the photo and still get that movement. So there are some different tools and techniques that you can use to express that movement, even in really high light situations. Now, this would be an example of where you might use a really fast shutter to freeze motion. Now, in this particular example of this hummingbird, you can still see movement expressed in the wings, because a hummingbird's wings, just like the wings of an insect or other animals, move really, really quickly. So you do get some frozen motion here. If you were taking a longer exposure, this hummingbird's wings would be nothing more than a blur. So the basic thing to remember about shutter speed is if you are dealing with a situation where you have to freeze that movement, you want a shorter shutter. You want a really, really fast shutter. A lot of people ask, what does a fast shutter mean? Or what shutter speed should I shoot at, especially if I'm just like hand holding my camera? Because even movements as you're holding your camera, any tiny little shake in your own hand or your own body, you'll see that movement come across in your photograph. So the general rule of thumb is that if you're hand holding your camera, you should be shooting at least 1/60th of a second, which is still a pretty slow shutter speed. And again, you might be wondering, well, isn't that only relevant if I'm using like an SLR or a mirrorless camera? There are camera apps that you can use that allow you to force your shutter speed. The one that I prefer, the one that I've been using for years when I really need to dig a little bit deeper into my camera settings, I can't do that on my native camera app on my iPhone. So I use an app called Camera Plus. And I'm gonna go ahead and type this into the chat just so you have it. If I recall correctly, it is not a free app. I'm not exactly sure how much it costs. I think it was just a few dollars when I got it. But it allows you to have a lot more creative control over your photos than just using your native camera app. Now, the second setting that we want to talk about in the exposure triangle is the aperture. The aperture is the one thing on a cell phone camera or a mobile device camera that you're not going to be able to change, because the aperture lives inside the lens that you're using. So if you're using like a camera like this, I have my 100mm macro lens attached to my SLR here. The aperture lives inside the lens, and it's the opening that allows light to come into the camera and hit the camera's sensor. And the aperture is basically a measurement of how open or how closed that hole is. This is expressed by what we call the F number. So you may see like every lens should have an F number. It might be like this lens in particular is a 100mm Canon macro. It's f2.8. If you have a telephoto lens that is a zoom lens. So you might have, like I have a 70 to 300 millimeter zoom lens. And I think that lens, the f-stop is f3.5 if you're at 70 millimeters, but then it goes up to like f5.6 if you're at 300 millimeters. So it does depend on what lens you're using. The lower the number, so like an f2.8 lens, means that the aperture opening is really wide open. The higher the f number, so if we're talking like f18, f11, that opening is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, the wider open the aperture is, the more light can come into your camera. The more closed that opening is, the less light that comes in. So you might be wondering, why does that matter? Why do we play with the aperture? The aperture dictates your depth of field, which is sometimes abbreviated as DOF, depth of field. And the depth of field is basically the plane of focus for your photograph. So if you have a really, really wide open aperture, so you'll see here at f2.8, if I'm photographing a person in front of a landscape, in this case mountains, the person can be in focus, but everything behind the person is going to be completely out of focus. This is a really good aperture to use, even if we get into like f2.8 up to like 5.6. This is really good for shooting things like portraits where you want to isolate a person in front of a background. If you're using a really stopped down, what we call a stop down aperture, like f22, you get a lot more depth of field. So now you're getting the person plus the mountains in the background in focus, which might be exactly what you want. For a lot of portrait photography though, we like to isolate that subject. If you have an iOS device, and I'm sure this exists, this setting in some capacity exists on things like Android devices as well, more like modern iPhone devices and maybe iPads too, I don't know, have what they call portrait mode. So does anybody have a newer iPhone that has portrait mode? Basically what the portrait mode does is it blurs the background. So it uses like a software hack to basically isolate the person that you're photographing, or if you're photographing a pet, you could even photograph, it doesn't have to be a person or a pet, you could photograph a coffee cup in front of some sort of scenery, but you isolate that subject in front of the background and the background gets nicely blurred. So it's sort of again, it's a software hack, it's not an aperture thing, but it's good to know that that exists too. So aperture dictates depth of field. And as a macro photographer, aperture is like the one setting that I care most about above all other settings. So finally, that third point in the exposure triangle is what we call ISO. And this is a measure of the camera's sensor sensitivity to light. So if you have a really low ISO, this is good for really high light situations. So a low ISO means that your sensor is less sensitive to light. So if I'm shooting something in broad daylight, it's super sunny, I have no issue with lighting conditions, I'm going to shoot at the lowest ISO possible. Now, if I'm heading into evening hours and it's getting kind of dark, or I'm shooting on like a really shady, cloudy day, or there's just another low light situation, I might need to bump my ISO up. So the number is going to be a little bit higher, but now my sensor is more sensitive to light. So it's going to be able to pull in all of that extraneous light to help make sure that I have a properly exposed image. Now, this might be a little bit technical and this is as technical as this presentation will get. The rest of this will be a lot more broad and surface level. But the exposure triangle is a really important thing to understand, because those three settings, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, dictate the exposure of your photo. And because your photo is nothing more than recording light on a light sensitive medium, as we started off talking about, that's the whole basis of photography. If you don't properly expose your photo probably won't be very good. Now, there are some things that you can do in post-processing to make it a little bit better, which again, we'll talk about tomorrow during our photo editing sessions. Any questions about the basics, that exposure triangle and some of those settings? Again, if you're on if you're on a big camera, like an SLR or mirrorless, you hopefully have taken your camera out of automatic mode at some point. So you've played around with some of those settings. You've played around with some of the capabilities of your camera. If you're only shooting on a mobile device, I do recommend, if you're interested in being able to like force some of those settings, I do recommend downloading an app like the Camera Plus. I see a conversation. So it looks like it was $3.99. There's the legacy one. I don't know about the legacy one at $2.99. So it's not terribly expensive. And if you're really interested in like getting into mobile photography, I do recommend splurging the $3 or $4 on like a good photography app. The one thing I forgot to mention about ISO. So when you bump down your ISO, you generally want to shoot at the lowest ISO possible because you're going to have less noise is what we call it. And noise is typically represented by like blue, green, and red like dots in your image. You'll tend to see noise more in the shadowy or the darker areas of a photo than you will in the light areas of your photo. So once you start bumping up that ISO, like if you're trying to do like star trails at night, let's say you want to get like super technical, you're going to set your camera up on a tripod, you're going to try to shoot the stars at night. So you're bumping up your ISO so that you're getting as much light as possible into your camera. You're going to see probably a lot more image noise come out in your final product. So there are some downsides. It's not just like, oh, hey, I have less light. Let me bump my ISO up, and that way it'll fix the problem. Well, it might fix the problem, but it might cause the new problem of having now added noise in your image, which you might be able to then pull out again in post-processing and clean that up a little bit. Now, this slide is really, like this modes of shooting is really more relevant to having a big camera. So the dial that you see there, that's pretty common on a lot of modern cameras, like a lot of SLR or mirrorless cameras. This is basically different modes of shooting. And I wanted to just mention a couple of these. We're not gonna get into each one of these, but I wanted to mention just a couple. So the first one is automatic mode. And if you put your camera in automatic, it kind of functions as a mobile, like the native camera app in your phone, right? Where you just open up the camera app and you point your camera anywhere and you can tap on the screen based on where you want the exposure, where you want the camera to expose for. So if you're looking at like a really bright sky, you might tap the sky and it'll now expose for the sky. This is kind of the same with a big camera. So if you're in auto mode, the camera is going to make all the decisions for you. And if you just got a camera and you're just learning how to use it, this is a really great way to just go out there and start shooting without really having to think about exposure. Once you start to get a little bit more comfortable, this is when you can start to play around with some additional modes of shooting. The one is aperture priority. So aperture priority allows you to choose your camera's aperture, and your camera is going to choose the other settings like the shutter. So this is really good if you want to play with like portrait photography and you know that you want to shoot at a wide open aperture to isolate your person from the background that they're standing in front of. So you can force the aperture and then your camera is going to do all the rest of the thinking for you. And this is typically represented by AV if you're on a Canon platform, or A if you're on a Nikon platform. If you're on a Sony or Panasonic or any other platform, I'm not exactly sure how this looks on those types of platforms. Likewise, you also can shoot in shutter priority, where you're choosing your camera's shutter and your camera's choosing the aperture. So again, it allows you to just think about one thing instead of having to think about three things: the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO. This is represented by an S for shutter on a Nikon. On a Canon, it's a little bit more convoluted. This is represented by TV, which you're probably like, what does that have to do with shutter? TV stands for time value, and shutter speed dictates the length of time that your shutter is open for. So that is TV on a Canon. Again, you'll notice a lot of other settings there that I'm not going to dive into. The only other one I'll mention here is the manual mode. If you really want to get into photography and you do have a big camera, I recommend, you're not going to hurt anything. I recommend just putting your camera in manual and start playing around with what these different settings are. There should be a little light meter that you can see in your camera. So as you look at different like parts of your environment, if you look up at the sky, it's probably going to show, oh wow, you're way overexposed. And then from there, you can start to think about what settings you need to change to get that properly exposed. Likewise, you can look at a really dark area of your environment and your camera is going to say, oh wow, this is really underexposed. And then you can start to think about what settings do you have to change in order to change that exposure to get it to where it needs to be. So again, this stuff is really relevant to using one of those bigger cameras, but you can still change some of these settings on a mobile device as well. Now your white balance basically removes any color cast that you might get from different lighting situations in your environment. So if you're shooting under like a fluorescent light or you're shooting under daylight, all of these different light sources have different color casts to them. And you can tell your camera, I'm shooting in this type of situation, in which case it's going to automatically correct for that. A lot of cameras too will allow you, even some of the mobile apps that I've used will allow you to input a very specific customized like color temperature, if you know, and I think is it in kelvins, the measurement of light, does anybody know? In any case, it allows you to actually like type in specifically like this is like the temperature of the light that I'm shooting in, and your camera will automatically correct for that. You can also correct for this in post, which is, in my mind, a little bit easier, especially if you're really struggling with getting your white balance just right. But white balance will ensure that your whites are truly white, that your blacks are truly black, and that everything else has a pretty accurate color representation in your photograph. And again, really easy to correct for in post. So here's an example. If I were shooting this seascape, here's an example of if I like forced my camera to shoot in tungsten white balance versus a custom. So it's 10,000 K, which again is, I don't know if that's kelvins or what. You can also see the difference between like shooting in shade, shooting in daylight. So I'll ask, thank you. So it is Kelvin, Christina, thank you for that. So I'll ask you, which one do you think looks best? If you were looking at these 8 images, which white balance do you think works best? Based on what you're seeing, there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm always just curious what people think. Shade. Shade, some people said flash. See, and it's really interesting because it's difficult for us to know because we weren't at this scene. We don't know what the original scene looked like to know what it should look like in the photograph for the audience who might be seeing it. So this is where you kind of have some creative control as the photographer to say, well, this is really what I want to be represented. I tend to think that the auto works really well. I think, the blue sky looks really great. If we look at the shade, the clouds look a little bit yellow or a little bit warm to me. But I think they look a little bit better in the daylight. The flash looks a little bit blue in my mind. But again, this is all like super subjective. I think the cloudy actually works well too. But there's a little bit of warmth that you see down in the sand on the auto. So don't hesitate. This is where I typically, when I'm doing macro photography, I shoot at a very specific white balance just because I'm so close to my subject that it really, and I'm using a flash as well. So it really forces like some weird colors. So I tend to shoot for shade or for cloudy white balance in macro photography. In other situations, I just stick it on automatic. And if I need to change anything, I change it in post-processing. So I don't worry so much about white balance. I just leave that on auto. So any questions so far about some general settings that you can set in your camera before we kind of go into some other like high level tips and tricks? Not seeing anything come into the chat. So now let's talk a little bit about stability. So stability is really important in photography. Most of what I shoot is all handheld, and in macro photography that can be a little bit difficult because you're so close to your subjects that even the slightest movement can really just render the entire image completely out of focus. So there are some things that you can do to get around this, both using handheld methods, but also using tripod. So the first one is just that, using a tripod. I should have also put a monopod on here. So a tripod, like the image that you see on your screen, has 3 legs. A monopod just has 1 leg, and it basically it kind of serves several purposes. It does provide some stability, but it can also alleviate some of the weight if you're carrying around a lot of equipment. Like if you have, this camera, like with my macro lens on it, it's not terribly heavy, but after a while of carrying it around, it does kind of start to weigh you down a little bit. So sticking this thing on a monopod just to be able to set it down and take some of that weight off is really, really helpful. It does also ensure that you're going to get a nice, crisp, clean shot without a lot of movement. The other methods that I tend to use more than a tripod, because I honestly, personally, I hate using a tripod and a monopod. I find them incredibly cumbersome, and I think they, in and of themselves, provide too much weight to a setup. I just like to simplify things. So some other things that you can do is really just steady your breathing. So, you know, taking, like if you're trying to take a breath, like breathe in, and then like take your shot as you're breathing out. That's one way to stabilize. You can also pull your elbows inward to your body. So that's a method that I tend to use quite a bit too. If you're trying to take a photo, even with like your arms, you see a lot of people holding out their cameras like this, that provides a certain unsteadiness. So really pulling your elbows in, holding them tight to your body, and then photographing like that will help provide some stability to otherwise wobbly arms. You can also just rest your camera on a really sturdy surface. So I often find a place in my environment to just rest my phone. Even if I'm kind of holding it with one hand, I might just rest it on a picnic table or a fence post or a rock. A lot of people also recommend using things like a bean bag. So if you just carry a bean bag around with you, I know most people probably aren't just carrying around a bean bag, but if you're really interested in photography, having a bean bag available is actually incredibly helpful because you can just kind of toss your phone in there and it molds to different situations, whether it's a rock or a fence post. And it's just a really easy way to get some added stability. Another thing that you can do for a tripod is get one of those gorilla mount tripods that have the flexi legs so that you can just put that tripod like on a fence post or on a pole, or, you know, it fits the situation. So it's really cool too. And they make all kinds of fairly inexpensive gorilla mount tripods for cell phones these days. And they're not specific to a certain type of phone. So you can fit any type of phone or mobile device in there. I also wanted to talk a little bit about lighting, because again, going back to our very beginning, photography is little more than just recording of light. So use natural light when possible. Natural light, you can't beat natural light, whether it's light from a window coming into your home, whether you're outside. That said, if you're using natural light, don't, like, especially if you're photographing people or animals or pets, don't have somebody facing the sun trying to photograph them, because that's going to cause them to squint. It also can create some really harsh shadows on people's faces. So you may have to find ways to diffuse natural light if it's too harsh and too direct. And there are some really cool ways that you can diffuse light. If you know you're going to go out for like a portrait session or something, one of the easiest things that you can use is just like a white sheet. You may have to find a way to like hang that white sheet up above whatever you're photographing so that the sunlight's kind of entering the white sheet and the light then gets diffused before it hits your subject. But that can create really, really beautiful lighting. It's going to make for a lot less harsh shadows on a person's face or even on a pet's face. So diffusion is really important. Now, your flash can work in certain situations. I think when we think flash photography, I always think of the red eyes, right? When you think about like people and flash photography, you always get like those red demon eyes. There are camera mechanisms that help alleviate the red eye. So sometimes, like I know my camera has a little, I can't remember exactly what it's called, someplace on the front of my camera. It basically shoots out like a burst of light before the flash goes off, and that helps to alleviate the red eye situation that you get. Nevertheless, flash can also create really, really harsh lighting situations. So if you are going to use a flash, it's best to use it diffused. Yeah, so Debbie said red eye reduction. And I think cell phones now, I think a lot of cell phones use red eye reduction too, where it just kind of pops out like a burst of light before it actually flashes and takes the photo. And that just helps, again, get rid of that red eye situation. Other ways that you can diffuse a light, whether you're using your phone or using a big camera, I've seen people just place like a big plastic bag on their camera. So if they have, I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to pop up my flash, maybe. They pop open their flash, and this camera doesn't have a flash, that's why I can't find it. So I like have 5 different SLR cameras, and this is my big one. This one doesn't have a built-in flash. So now I feel like a big idiot. But if it did, if I was using one of my other cameras that had the flash just pops up. You can just get like a white plastic bag that you literally just like tie over top of it. So it kind of creates this nice like bubble effect, and your light will be nicely diffused when it comes out of there. So instead of being a super harsh light. Generally, the further away your diffusion material is from the source of the light, the more diffuse it will be. So if you are going to use some sort of light diffuser, you don't want that material to be super, super close to your flash. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty much useless. So you can use things like a white sheet. You can use different fabric. For my macro photography, I found some really, really good diffusion material in, they're called stencil blanks from a craft store. And it's basically just sheets of like white plastic material that you would use to create your own custom stencil out of. But it's really, really great diffusion material, which I've been searching for many years. And I finally found it in this like cheap little plastic material, which is great. So when taking pictures of plants or soil for research, is it best to use dark black or white color background, gray or white? Oh, that's a great question. That really depends on, I think, your lighting situation. You could use either. I would recommend, actually, so black could work really well. The issue with black, especially if you're photographing like a darker color leaf, if it's like a dark green, you're gonna lose a lot of detail because your camera is gonna want to expose probably really dark because the whole scene is dark. What I would recommend looking into is there's a whole genre of photography called Meet Your Neighbors. And I know this because it's a lot of macro photographers who are involved. And basically it's people who create these like white boxes and photograph things on clean white backgrounds. And they have all kinds of tutorials online. I'm going to go ahead and type this in the chat. They have all kinds of tutorials online on like how to create these customized white boxes. And you can adapt some of their designs and use that. Photographing, what you want to avoid, I'll tell you this much, because I've never actually like photographed like plants against white backgrounds. Most of my work is like in situ insects, which means in their natural environment. I'm not collecting or anything. But the thing that you want to do is if you're photographing a leaf or soil or something else, try to move it away from the background. You don't want to photograph that thing right against the background because that's going to create some unsightly shadows. So if you pull it away from the background and you have a full like white box that you're photographing in, now if you're photographing something like soil, that might not be as relevant unless you can find a way to like keep that soil in some sort of like plastic see-through medium that you can then pull away from your background. But with plants, this should be fairly easy and intuitive to do. You could just come up with a mechanism to like clip that leaf up so it sort of stands straight up, and then you have the background set maybe a foot or so in the background, and then you would photograph it and you would get no shadows. And we can talk more specifically about that particular setup. I can see it in my mind's eye, but I'm not sure if I'm explaining it really well at the moment. So another thing to be mindful of is you can use a reflector to add some fill light. And this works really well if you're photographing people. It could work really well though if you are photographing something like plants in a white box, because you might have a situation where you have really, really good light coming from this angle, but you have some shadows that are happening on like the other side of your subject. So in that case, and this works really well too if you're just using natural sunlight and you're outside. Rachel talked about this in our video production bootcamp a couple of weeks ago. You can buy commercial reflectors. Some of them actually fold down like really, really small. They're like wire edges, and then they have some sort of like reflective paper, not paper, but like fabric. And they fold down really, really small. Or you can just go to the store and buy like a white piece of foam core and just carry that around with you. You probably won't be able to like fold that down into a really small, small thing to just throw in your camera bag, but it's really cheap. It's just a sheet of white foam core. It's really lightweight. And basically you would just hold that near your subject, or you could even have like the subject hold it or somebody else hold it so that the sunlight would like bounce off of that and then reflect onto your subject's face and fill in some of those shadows that could be happening. It's just one more tip to use a very inexpensive piece of equipment. Now, I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about specific lenses, because the lenses are going to be pretty specific to what it is that you want to photograph. I get a lot of questions from my peers in Extension like, hey, I have some money, I want to buy a camera kit. Where do I start with lenses? And I always ask them, well, what is it that you want to photograph? Because that's going to dictate what lenses you should buy. If you want to do a lot of like insect photography, or if you want to do like plant disease photography for our A&R folks, then you probably want to get into some macro stuff. If you want to do more landscapes, cityscapes, if you want to do like event photography, then maybe a wide angle lens could be really good. If you're really interested in something like wildlife photography, you might want to think about a telephoto lens because you're going to have some zoom capability there that's going to allow you to get a little bit closer to your wildlife without getting physically closer to them. Now, all of these options also exist for mobile phones. So you can buy different kits, you can buy different single lenses that will allow you to get telephoto capability, wide angle capability, and macro capability, in addition to several others. Those kits can really add up. Some of, like, you might be thinking like a lens for my mobile device is going to be super inexpensive, like maybe just a couple of dollars. Some of these lenses can be like $80, $100, $150 for like a single lens that just attaches to your mobile phone. But depending on the type of photography you're doing, these can be a really, really good option, particularly if you really want to get into like mobile phone photography. Now, there are ones that are universal for a phone that just kind of snap on. Some of them just work as like clips, and they'll just kind of snap onto your phone lens. And when you upgrade your phone in a year or two, that will work for your new phone too. Other lenses are specific to the phone. So I made the mistake of buying one of these types a couple of years ago. I spent like $80 on this kit of lenses, and it was for that specific model of iPhone that I had at the time. And then I got a new phone and it rendered that whole kit of lenses completely useless. I will say that kit of lenses, I just didn't find it to be worth the money anyway. There are other ways that I could achieve similar results at a much, much lower cost. So any questions about some of those things before we get into some compositional discussion? I want to show some examples. There's a lot of different photography rules out there. And of course, rules are meant to be broken, but I think it is a good idea just to kind of showcase how some of these rules can work in different photographs. And I think that they'll provide you some insights just to see the world around you a little bit differently. It really helps to kind of train your eye on how to look for different photographic compositions. So we'll start with the most popular photography rule, which many of you have probably heard before, which is the rule of thirds. And you can think of the rule of thirds as basically dividing whatever subject you're looking at or whatever situation you're looking at into a tic-tac-toe board. So you have two lines running horizontal, two lines running vertical. I did that wrong. So this basically creates a grid of 9 boxes. And the general rule of thumb is that where those lines intersect, those 4 points where your lines intersect, that is where you're going to have the most visual interest in your photograph. It also means that you can divide the composition into like different vertical or different horizontal planes, and you want to put the points of interest on those planes. So I wanted to show some examples of how we can use the rule of thirds in different photographs. So here's some food photography. I wanted to talk a little bit about food photography because I think a lot of our FCS educators are interested in food photography. I think they probably ask me the most questions about photography, like how do I get great like kitchen shots or great recipe shots. So here's a great example of where the rule of thirds is used. You have the line of that bowl kind of along that one plane where you would think if this was divided into a tic-tac-toe board, that would be almost perfectly aligned with one of those vertical lines. Here's another example. So you have the woman kind of aligned on one plane, and then you have this like blank wall. It's okay to have sort of blank space in your photograph. That does add some visual appeal. I think most people, and this is something that even I have a hard time with as an insect photographer, is I want to place my subject like smack right dab and like in the middle of the photograph, and that's like the primary thing. But you can add a lot of visual interest by just placing your subject slightly off center and thinking about how you can divide that into thirds. And Debbie said, making food look good in photos is hard. We will talk about that because it is hard. I think a lot of questions I get from people are like, I made this beautiful recipe and it looked good in person, but then I photographed it and it looked like a pile of barf. And a lot of that has to do with like lighting, but we will have a conversation about that. So you can use the rule of thirds even when you're photographing people. Here's an example of 2 children kind of pointing. And again, just placing your subject slightly off center really does help to follow that rule of thirds quite well. Here's another example, whereas if you were thinking about this being divided, it doesn't follow the rule of thirds perfectly. It's not like she's right centered on where those lines would fall, but again, she's also not perfectly centered in that photograph. So you get a little bit of sense of context and environment here too. It almost looks like this little girl's probably out at a picnic. There's some other people in the shot. We do get some limbs that are, or some people that are kind of cut in half, which tends to be one of the rules that we advise against. In this situation, it works because this guy in the background is just sort of providing some context to the situation, and he's not the subject of the photo. It's also okay generally to crop people's heads, especially in a close-up shot like this. But one of the things with people that we want to avoid is like cutting off somebody's limb, especially if they're like the primary subject of your photograph. And that's something that I see happen all the time, where if it's a pet photo, like the ears of the cat have been cut off. If it's like a dog photo, the tail has been cut off. You want to avoid doing some of those things in your photographs of people. Another rule that you can use is the leading lines rule, which basically means that you are creating sort of different lines, and they don't have to be, they can be more like abstract, like in concept. They don't have to be like actual lines that you see. When we talk about leading lines, the most, I think the most used example is like a roadway or a bridge, where you have like these very specific lines kind of going into your shot. Here's an example of how this photographer used the line of this person's hands. Your eye is drawn to the plate where the food is coming out because the hands are creating that sense of like inward motion, leading your eye to that place. So that's a good example of how to use leading lines. Here's another one where you have this bin here and this great line just kind of leading directly up to where the motion in the photograph is happening. I think this happened because the photographer got on a slightly lower angle to take the photograph, as opposed to like, you know, oh, hey, this is sort of out of focus. A lot of people might think, I don't want any of this bin to even be in the photograph. But by including the bin, it creates a sense of depth because this part is out of focus and the woman is in focus, but it also has that great leading line directly up to the woman. So again, just some things to think about. Here are other examples of how you can use lines in your photo. We have a couple different lines happening here. Of course, we have just the horizon, and then we also have the sprayer. And we have some different coloration here of just the vegetation that's growing. Some more examples of leading lines here. You have actually a couple. So you have the boy's arm, and then you also have this raised bed wall that's sort of coming in at this point of the action of the watering can, sort of in the motion, putting water onto the garden. So just some simple examples of where you can use leading lines. Something else I wanted to mention was the use of background. So I think that this is probably the thing that I see most in just candid shots that I see people take, is they have really, really messy backgrounds, and the background just has a lot of stuff happening. Sometimes this happens because, especially with cell phone shots, again, we don't have the luxury of being able to control the aperture, so we can't control the depth of field. So when you take a photo, your plane of focus is pretty much anything that your camera can see. So if you're not isolating your subject, then you end up getting a really, really messy background in a lot of cases. That's the beauty of the portrait mode on the iOS like camera app now, is because you can isolate your subject from all of that stuff that could be happening in the background. So one easy way to isolate your subject is just to put them against a really, really nice clean background. You can also create some visual appeal by doing some different things. So in this photo, we have some cocktails here. This could have just been left as a completely blank wall, but instead the photographer, and I actually cropped some of this out to accommodate this ratio for the slide, but there was a nice like palm leaf sort of coming into the photo, and then it created this beautiful shadow against the backdrop, which just sort of provides this more tropical feel. And you have tropical fruit here. So when you're looking at this, you kind of get that context of, oh, this is like a beach vacation and we're drinking tropical cocktails and there's a palm leaf shadow against the background. So you really play with your backgrounds and see how they might be able to provide some visual interest to your photograph. So this actually is one of my photos. I mentioned I'm an insect photographer. This is just a photo of a bumblebee on a purple coneflower. Notice how we're sort of using the leading lines here with the stem sort of leading you up to that bee. Also kind of using the rule of thirds. I probably wasn't, I mean, I don't even want to say probably. I can tell you I was in no way thinking about these rules because I often don't think about photography rules when I'm out shooting. So it was probably unintentional. But you do have the rule of thirds represented here. You have that nice leading line of the stem. And then by using a more wide open aperture, I was able to isolate that single coneflower against the background of coneflowers. But because they're all perfectly out of focus, it still provides the context that this is a garden. You have multiple flowers happening here, and you can still see that they're coneflowers, but they're all nicely out of focus. So a couple different rules at play here. So kind of going a little bit against our rule of thirds is you can place stuff smack dab in the middle of your photograph, and you can play with some symmetry. So this is not perfect symmetry happening. If we like divided this into half, it's not a mirrored situation, but there is a sense of real symmetry and really just design and pattern happening in this photograph, and that provides some really nice visual appeal. Similarly, in a photograph like this, you almost could split this photo in half and fold it, and it almost is a mirrored situation. It's not, of course, perfect, but there is a sense of symmetry here, and that can provide for some nice visual appeal as well. So these might seem like hard, fast rules, especially that rule of thirds, because you'll hear that a lot pop up when we talk about photography. But again, rules are meant to be broken, so play with them. One more thing, I think this is the last rule I have, that you can do is framing your shot. And you can frame your shot pretty literally by like taking a photograph through like a physical frame of some sort. Sometimes I see this a lot in garden photography where people are out in like an old historic garden and there's like a structure outside and they take like a photo of the garden through like a window frame of a wall or another building. But you can also look for naturally occurring frames. So in this case, this tree is kind of nicely framing that little white building and that little, I don't know exactly what that building is, but it provides just a sense of framing in your photograph. And you can do this pretty easily too. You just kind of have to be on the lookout for situations that lend themselves really nicely to this natural sense of framing. So any questions? Any questions so far before we head into some other like specific types of photography? We only have a few minutes here, so we're just kind of gonna wrap up. I did want to mention digital zoom versus optical zoom. This is really important, especially for those using mobile cameras. So if you're on your cell phone, for example, and you open up just your native camera app, if you do like on the camera app on an iOS device, you can do like the 2-finger pinch where you're just kind of coming in here and like zooming in. So I'm zooming in on my wall right now. That is creating what we call digital zoom, which is basically it's like forcing zoom by cropping out a huge portion of your photo, but it's doing just that. It's cropping. It's not actually zooming in optically. You're just cropping out a good majority of your photo. And by doing so, you're losing a significant amount of resolution in your photograph. So even if you pull out your phone right now and you open up the camera app on your phone and you do that pinch and you zoom really, really far in, you can see the quality on your screen go significantly down. Again, that's because your photo is being heavily, heavily cropped. In most situations, what you want to do is focus on optical zoom. And an optical zoom means that there are pieces of glass, there are like literal optical elements that are creating the sense of zoom. So this is what happens when we're using a camera like this and you have a big lens. This lens is creating the sense of zoom. It's not being forced in any way through software or things like that. So I just kind of wanted to mention quickly there, you want to avoid digital zoom if at all possible. And if you're like, well, I can't, I really need to get closer to my subject. If you need to get closer to your subject, try to get physically closer to your subject by like walking toward your subject. That's not always possible in all situations, but if you can get physically closer, that's going to be the better option for you. So let's talk a little bit about food photography for everybody who might be doing recipes or other types of like kitchen food. I think this is one of the big things right now, especially with everybody working virtually. People are doing a lot in their kitchens and they want to like share recipes on Facebook, but sometimes it's really hard to get really great video and photos of the food in your kitchen. So some of the recommendations that I have is you can play with your focus. If you have a really great food scene that you want to photograph, try photographing it in portrait mode on your cell phone instead of just your traditional like native camera like photo mode. because again, you're kind of forcing focus on a particular part of that photograph, which could be really cool. You can also play a lot with color. Color is very difficult to capture well in food, I think, unless you're using natural light, which is another recommendation, is if at all possible, use natural light. If you don't have a window, like a nice big window in your kitchen, then ask yourself, where do you have a lot of natural light coming into your home? And could you stage a whole setup near that place in your home, or could you even just go outside? A lot of great food photographers will use things like they actually have like a background that they use instead of trying to photograph something like on their kitchen counter, which like we have countertops in our home that are highly reflective. And we also have lights directly above that counter. So anytime I'm trying to photograph on it, all you see is the reflection back of the lights directly above. And how do you avoid that? The best way to avoid it is actually just create for yourself a little food studio. And this could be as simple as like a piece of plywood with a nice sheet of like contact paper that looks like marble, probably a lighter color, because lighter colors are going to work really well for like food, but create just that nice little studio for yourself. And then you can just move that around your home to where the light works best. So if that's in your bedroom, fine, photograph the food in your bedroom. If that's like, you know, by some like sliding glass door that's letting out a ton of light, fine. Just take a little like food tray with that little studio that you've created and go stage your food shot over there. Your audience is never going to know unless you have like stuff in the background that shows them that this wasn't like your kitchen. But otherwise, that could be a really cool thing to do. And you could do that fairly inexpensively. Just set up a little food studio for yourself. You'll often see people shooting straight down on their photograph. That works really well too. And part of the reason why that works really well, particularly for those of us who are photographing things from home, is you don't have to worry about what's happening in the background now because you're just shooting that particular scene straight down. So like this shot that you see here on the left of these oranges and maybe apples, just shot straight down. And a lot of food photography is shot in that way. So let's give some tips and tricks for photographing people. So the biggest tip that I can give you for photographing people, particularly children, is to get on eye level with them. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that I see people, especially people photographing like their own children. And this is true of photographing pets as well. We tend to want to photograph our children and pets from our perspective. So we're looking down on them, which makes them look very small. But it's best to get down on their level, get down to their world, because that allows you to see things from their perspective. It also just creates a less distorted view of them. So if I was photographing this little girl, for example, from my height, she might look a little bit distorted from my perspective. But when I get down on her level, I'm showing her as she is. And it creates for just a much more engaging and dynamic perspective to this child. Try to create genuine emotion. And I think that this is probably something that most like portrait photographers or studio photographers struggle with. I can think about all the times that we have paid our family photographer to take photos of my kids and she says, smile, and they give the biggest, cheesiest, like they finally hit that age where like their smiles are no longer genuine when you say, hey, smile, and you get this really forced smile out of your children. Try to make them laugh. If you can make people laugh or express true emotion that's more candid, you're gonna get much better people photos if you can do that. Also, declutter your background. So again, I can't stress enough how important it is to really think strategically about what is in the background of your shot. Don't just focus on what's in the foreground. Don't just focus on your subject. You know, is there like a weird arm coming out of the like this person's head that just is going to come across weird in the final photograph? And if so, then move to a slightly different angle so that arm isn't coming out of that person's head. Use natural lighting when possible. And if it's not possible, then use a flash, but do make sure that it's nice diffused light. And again, do that stuff like we talked about, like a plastic bag or a sheet or something else that can just provide some added diffusion to that person. And then finally, try to isolate your subject too. So again, on a mobile device, use that portrait mode if you have it, because it does provide some really nice, it just provides a really nice like dynamic to the photo that you're not gonna get just by taking the photo in normal mode. So lastly, I did want to mention here macro photography. This is my particular area of specialization. And I like talking about it because I think it's super relevant, particularly for anybody working in natural resources, horticulture, or agriculture. Macro photography is great for showing insects. It's great for showing plant diseases. It's great for showing like really, really tiny things in like otherworldly magnification. One of the biggest hints that I can give you, again, clean backgrounds, which is very difficult to do when you're photographing like vegetation or photographing insects, because there tends to just be a lot going on around them, right? When you get on their level and you photograph like a spider on a branch, you may have a ton of leaves, you may have blades of grass, and those all just clutter what's happening in your frame. So if you can find a way to get rid of the clutter, you'll end up with a better shot. Also, use those narrower apertures. So bump up your aperture so it's going to be narrower. You're going to get greater depth of field. Generally speaking, and there's a lot of technical information that I could give on this subject, we're not going to dive too much into technical information. The closer you are to your subject physically, the less depth of field you're going to have anyway. So when you're this close to a little jumping spider, your depth of field is so minimal. So you have to find a way to increase your depth of field, and you do that by bumping up your aperture. Finally, this is the very last tip that I'm going to give you, and I think that this is relevant. It's relevant for macro photography specifically, but doesn't have to be bugs, doesn't have to be plant diseases. It's just kind of a fun thing that you can play around with. This is also a really, really great tip if you are interested in doing a fun activity with youth or master gardeners or Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalists, which I've done before, is you can break the lens out of an old disposable camera. So I have broken the lens. I don't know if you can see this super well. This little shiny thing, my finger's behind it now. And I've just put this bright pink duct tape around it so that I have something to hold on to, because these lenses are really small. If you just hold this in front of the camera on your phone, you can get pretty good magnification. So as an example, I took this shot of a paper clip earlier this morning, and then I held, and this was at the closest I could get physically to this paper clip with my phone without any attachments or anything, and still keep that paper clip into focus. And then I held my little free lens in front of it, and this is what you can achieve. So just with this little free, silly thing, you can achieve pretty great magnification. Now you'll see the clarity isn't going to be as great as if you were photographing with like a high-end camera, like an SLR or a mirrorless. But for photographing something like a plant disease or an insect that you just need to send for identification, this can be just a really, really fun method of playing around with macro photography. I will say it's a little bit difficult to come by disposable cameras these days, because a lot of like drugstores no longer do film development in-house. They usually collect all of their like cameras that are coming in and they send them away, and they don't actually have the shell of the disposable camera anymore. But if you're lucky, you can still find them. I did a workshop last summer with a group at a local nature center where we went out and like everybody was asked to like collect disposable cameras from local camera centers. And we had, I think we ended up getting like 10 or 12. Each camera has 2 to 3 lenses in it that you can break apart, and that function is really, really great free macro lenses. So it's a really great idea to do like just a fun little workshop, especially with youth, if you're interested in doing something like that. So those are my tips and tricks for getting started with photography. We will be back tomorrow. Tomorrow's session, I don't anticipate filling the full hour with. If you have questions or if you have photographs that you know, like, hey, I took this photo and I'm struggling to really edit it, bring those with you, and we can try to offer some tips and recommendations on how to get the most out of editing programs on those particular photos. So that's what I have for you. I'll stick around here for a few minutes in case anybody has questions. But thanks everybody for another great session. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. And this will be posted on the LOD site along with all of our other sessions.